The tray hit the seatback table at 34 degrees Celsius with a hard, flat clack. On it sat half a portion of cold chicken and rice, the corner of a bread roll with a bite already taken out of it, and a cup of yogurt with the foil peeled back. Someone else's leftovers. Food a passenger up front had already sent away. "There you go," the flight attendant said, her voice sweet as syrup, her eyes ice cold. "We're out of hot meals. You'll understand the flight's full today." The man in seat 34C didn't say a word. He wore a faded gray hoodie and a 6-year-old girl was asleep against his shoulder. He just looked at the tray, then up at the attendant. Her name tag read Chelsea and gave a small nod. Nobody in the cabin noticed. Nobody knew who the man in the worn hoodie actually was. But 21 minutes later, before the wheels even touched the runway, Chelsea Vaughn would be the one escorted to the back of that cabin, hands shaking, tears running down her face while 100 passengers turned to watch. This is the story of Nathan Brooks. And what happens next will make you rethink how quickly we decide who a person is just by looking at them. Nathan Brooks boarded Altair Airways Flight 216 at 8:47 in the morning, almost the last person on. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. One hand carried a faded canvas backpack. The other held the tiny hand of his daughter. Her name was Sophie, 6 years old, in a yellow dress printed with little birds clutching a stuffed rabbit so old that one of its ears was hanging by a thread. "Where are our seats, Daddy?" Sophie asked, looking up with big round eyes. "Row 34, sweetheart, by the window. You'll get to see the clouds." Nathan stood about 6 feet tall, lean, his simple haircut already showing a few gray hairs, though he was only 35. On his left hand, he still wore a thin silver wedding band. His wife, Hannah, had passed away almost a year before. If you'd looked at Nathan that morning, the old hoodie, the worn sneakers, the cheap backpack, you'd have figured him for an ordinary single dad just scraping by on a modest paycheck. You wouldn't have looked twice. And that was exactly what Nathan wanted. He settled Sophie into the window seat, buckled her in, then took a worn leather notebook out of his backpack. He opened it, glanced at a few handwritten lines, and closed it again. Nobody noticed the small gesture. But if anyone had happened to read over his shoulder, they'd have seen a list on that page, the names of the cabin crew, the flight number, and 3 words underlined in capital letters: service evaluation. He put the notebook away, unzipped a small inner pocket, and touched something he always carried, an oval silver locket with a tiny photo of Hannah smiling inside. "Today's a special day, right, Daddy?" Sophie whispered. "That's right. Today we're going to see Mommy's lighthouse. Do you remember what I promised her?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "Every year on my birthday we go to the sea to visit Mommy." Nathan smiled and squeezed her hand. It was the last promise he'd made to Hannah before she closed her eyes. Every year on Sophie's birthday, the two of them would fly back to Maribel Cove, the coastal town where Hannah grew up, home to the lighthouse where Nathan had proposed to her 10 years earlier. Today was the first flight of that promise. There was one small thing nobody on that flight caught. When Sophie dropped her stuffed rabbit onto the floor, a passenger behind them accidentally kicked it. Nathan bent down, picked it up, dusted it off, handed it back to his daughter, then turned and said, "No worries, thanks," even though the man hadn't apologized. He didn't scowl. He wasn't annoyed. There was a stillness in him, the kind that belongs to a person who has already walked through the worst thing life can throw at them and can't be shaken by anything smaller. Hannah had gone quickly from an illness nobody could get ahead of. In her final months, when she still had the strength to talk, she used to tell Nathan about the lighthouse, the beach of her childhood, the afternoons she'd spent counting waves. "Take her there," she'd said. "Once a year is enough, so she knows where her mother came from." Nathan had promised. And Nathan had never been a man who broke a promise. He had no idea that before the plane landed, that simple promise would be tested in a way he never saw coming. The aircraft began to taxi toward the runway. Nathan looked out the window, still holding the locket. He hadn't told anyone that beyond being a dad taking his daughter to the sea, he had another reason to be on Flight 216 that morning. But we'll get to that. 2 rows ahead of Nathan in seat 3. 2A sat Gregory Pierce. You could hear Gregory before you saw him. No, listen carefully." His voice rang out the moment the plane leveled off. "I'm a platinum member, 1.2 million miles with this airline. I'm not used to a window seat. I need the aisle, and I need one more pillow." Gregory Pierce was around 50, in an expensive charcoal suit, an oversized watch flashing on his wrist that he made sure to show off whenever he waved a hand. He was the kind of man who believed the number in his bank account gave him the right to decide how everyone else should behave. The attendant standing beside him nodded along eagerly. "Of course, Mr. Pierce, I'll take care of it right away." That was Chelsea Vaughn. Chelsea had worked at Altair Airways for 4 years. She was 30 sharp and had one particular talent: in 3 seconds she could look at a passenger and file them away. First class or coach, worth flattering or worth ignoring, might leave her a good line on the survey or not worth the bother. With Gregory Pierce, Chelsea had already made up her mind. He was a VIP. She brought him his second pillow, poured him a glass of wine before the official service even started, and smiled at him the smile she reserved for people she'd decided mattered. There'd been an early sign if anyone had been watching. Right after takeoff, an elderly man in row 36 pressed the call button because he wanted a blanket. The light stayed on for nearly 10 minutes. Chelsea walked past it 3 times. On the 4th pass, it was Priya who brought the man his blanket. Chelsea didn't serve people who couldn't do anything for her. That was her rule, though she'd never once said it out loud. With Nathan Brooks in 34C, the old hoodie, the small child, the cheap backpack, Chelsea had made up her mind too. And she'd filed him under not worth the bother. Standing behind Chelsea near the galley was a younger attendant named Priya Nair. Priya had been on the job 8 months. She noticed everything: the way Chelsea leaned toward Gregory, the way she breezed past Nathan's row without asking if he needed anything. Priya frowned, but she was young, she was new, and she'd already learned that at Altair you didn't cross Chelsea Vaughn. And above them all was Diane Kessler, the flight's lead cabin attendant. Diane was 52, 28 years in the job, and she believed her experience meant she never had to double-check anything. When there was a conflict on her flight, Diane had one simple rule: back your crew and assume the difficult passenger is always the one in the wrong. Those 3 people, arrogant Chelsea, entitled Gregory, and curious Diane, were about to make one shared mistake. A mistake not one of them saw coming. It was 9:12 in the morning. The plane was still about an hour and 40 minutes from landing. The meal service began at 9:30. Chelsea pushed the meal cart down the aisle with Priya. Nathan had pre-ordered a meal for himself and one for Sophie when he bought the tickets. He was always careful about things like that. On the flight system right next to seat 34C, there was a small note: 2 meals pre-ordered, 1 adult, 1 child. But when the cart reached row 32, Gregory Pierce waved his hand. "Give me 2 of the chicken," he said. "I'm hungry. 1 isn't enough." Chelsea glanced at the cart. She knew the hot chicken meals were limited, but she also knew whose day she wanted to make. "Of course, Mr. Pierce," she said, and set 2 steaming chicken trays in front of him. When the cart reached row 34, Nathan looked up. "Hi there. I pre-ordered 2 meals, 1 for me and 1 for my daughter." Chelsea looked at the cart. She looked at the screen. She saw the note about the 2 pre-ordered meals, and then she looked at Nathan, the hoodie, the kid, the backpack, and she made a choice. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said with no apology anywhere in her voice. "The chicken's gone. Must have been a mix-up in the system." "But I pre-ordered it," Nathan said gently, "and I just watched you hand 2 of them to the passenger up front." The air stalled for a second. Priya behind her opened her mouth to say something, but Chelsea was faster. "He's a platinum member," Chelsea said, as if that explained everything. "As for your meal..." She reached down to the bottom shelf of the cart where the collected trays were stacked. She pulled one out, half a portion of cold chicken and rice, a bitten corner of bread roll, a cup of yogurt already opened. Someone up in the forward cabin had sent it back untouched by the look of it, except it clearly wasn't untouched at all. She set it down on Nathan's table. Clack. "There's your meal. We're out of hot food. You'll understand the flight's full." Sophie, just waking up, looked at the tray, then at her dad. "Daddy, why does our food look weird? Theirs is still full." She pointed at the steaming trays a few rows ahead. Nathan put a hand on his daughter's shoulder, gentle. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm not that hungry. Let me give you my part." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply nudged the tray of leftovers aside, took Sophie's meal, a pasta dish that Chelsea had reluctantly handed the child, and began cutting it into small pieces for her. But beneath that calm, Nathan had memorized everything. The time, the name on the tag, the note in the system he'd just seen. And in his head, a line was already being written neat and cold, as if he were filling out a form. Because that was exactly what he was about to do. That was Chelsea Vaughn's first mistake. At the time, it didn't look like a mistake. 30 minutes passed. Nathan didn't eat. He just sat there giving his portion to his daughter, now and then writing a few lines in the leather notebook. When Chelsea pushed the drinks cart through a second time, she stopped at row 32. "Mr. Pierce, more wine or coffee?" "Wine, and fill it properly this time." Gregory smirked, not bothering with a thank you. Chelsea filled his glass, threw in a packet of cashews, reserved for our first-class guests, and rolled the cart on. She went straight past row 34. No stop. No question. "Excuse me," Nathan called softly. "Could my daughter have a glass of apple juice?" Chelsea didn't even turn around. "In a minute. I'm busy." And she disappeared toward the galley. In a minute never came. Priya, standing at the galley, saw all of it. She quietly poured a glass of apple juice and brought it to Sophie. "Here you go, sweetheart." "Thank you," Sophie said. Nathan looked up at Priya, and there was something in his eyes that made her pause. Not anger, but a deep kind of attention, as if he were memorizing her too. But he was memorizing her a different way. "Thank you, Priya," Nathan said, reading her name tag. "That was very kind." Priya smiled, a little flustered, and turned away. She didn't understand why that small thank you warmed her so much. She also didn't know that her name had just been written into a notebook in a column entirely separate from Chelsea's. 15 minutes later, Chelsea came back to collect trays. When she reached row 34, she picked up the leftover tray still sitting untouched on Nathan's table. He hadn't touched a bite of it, and looked at it with distaste, as if he were the one at fault for not eating. "Not eating?" she asked, her tone mocking. "Awfully picky." Nathan looked up. "Do you often serve one passenger's returned food to another?" he asked, not sharp at all, just plainly like a question. Chelsea froze for half a second, but she didn't answer. She just yanked the tray away and moved on. Sophie tugged her dad's sleeve. "Daddy, does she not like us?" Nathan looked at his daughter for a long moment. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to teach her how to hate anyone. "It's not that she doesn't like us," he said softly. "She just hasn't really seen us yet. Some people look at your clothes before they see who you are. That's their business, not ours." Sophie nodded, then rested her head against him and closed her eyes. Nathan opened the leather notebook. He wrote in that neat hand, 10:02, seat 34C, 2 meals pre-ordered refused. Returned tray served instead. Row 36, blanket request ignored 4 times. Attendant Vaughn, clear tiered service by perceived class. Attendant Nair, proactive correction. He closed it. On this plane, someone was quietly keeping score and nobody knew it. At 10:05, things escalated. Gregory Pierce, after his second glass of wine, decided he needed to stretch his legs. He stood, walked toward the rear lavatory, and as he passed row 34, he glanced at Nathan and Sophie. "Well," he said loudly, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "They let just about anybody on these days. Ratty clothes, crying kids. Flying used to mean something." A few passengers turned to look. Sophie, who didn't understand the words but felt the cruelty in the tone, pressed close to her dad. Nathan looked up at Gregory. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said very calmly, "My daughter isn't crying. She's just thirsty. But thank you for your concern." Gregory snorted and walked on. But on his way back, he stopped at the galley and said to Chelsea, deliberately loud enough to carry, "You ought to look at who's allowed up in this cabin. Some people ruin the whole experience for us VIPs." And Chelsea, instead of diffusing it, nodded along. "I hear you, sir. Some people just don't know where they belong." Nathan heard that line crystal clear. The whole cabin heard it. An elderly woman across the aisle in row 33 frowned. A young college student named Devin Klein, sitting right behind Nathan in 35C, quietly took his phone out of his pocket. He didn't say anything. He just opened the camera, propped the phone at an angle on his tray table, and started recording. Devin didn't know what he was recording yet, but something felt wrong, and instinct told him he ought to have it on file. The elderly woman in 33 leaned across the aisle. "Are you all right?" she asked Nathan. "I saw the whole thing. The way they've treated you and your little girl isn't right." "Thank you, ma'am," Nathan answered. "We're okay." But the old woman's kindness only seemed to irritate Chelsea further. She turned back toward the galley and said just loud enough to Priya, "People love to make a scene. Cheapest ticket on the plane, acting like they're in first." Priya lowered her head and said nothing, but her hand tightened around the tray she was holding. Up in row 32, Gregory Pierce smiled. To him, this was entertainment. He didn't even bother lowering his voice as he told his seatmate, See, this is why I always fly first, so I don't have to sit near these types. The cabin was split now. On one side, uneasy faces and small shakes of the head. On the other, Gregory Chelsea and the indifference of the people who chose not to look. Nobody knew the scales were about to tip, or how fast. A few minutes later, Chelsea came back down the aisle with a tray of warm chocolate cookies, a small mid-flight treat. She stopped at row 32 and offered Gregory 2 with that reserved smile. She stopped at the rows around him. And then deliberately, obviously, she skipped row 34 entirely, as if the seats were empty. Sophie watched the cookies go by, said nothing, and looked down at her lap. Nathan saw it. He didn't ask for one. He simply opened his notebook, added a line, and closed it again. Somewhere in a government office, weeks from now, a paragraph would be written because of a plate of cookies that a 6-year-old wasn't offered. Chelsea had no idea she was writing that paragraph for him, one small cruelty at a time. That was the moment everything began to change. Only nobody had realized it yet. Nathan stood up. For the first time the whole flight he left his seat. He didn't head toward Gregory. He walked straight to the galley where Chelsea was standing. "Excuse me," he said, his voice still even. "I'd like a word. I pre-ordered and paid for 2 meals. My daughter got hers. I don't need mine anymore. But I think you should know that the way you just spoke about the passengers on this flight and the way you've served them probably doesn't line up with the standards Altair commits to." He said it very politely. Not a rude word in it. But there was something in the way he chose those words, standards, commits to Altair, that didn't sound like an ordinary passenger's complaint. Chelsea didn't catch it. All she heard was a man in an old hoodie daring to lecture her. "Listen," she said, crossing her arms. "I served according to the situation. Full flight, limited food. If you're not happy, I can get the lead attendant. But I'll warn you now, if you keep causing a disturbance, we have the right to write you up for disorderly conduct on board. And that could mean trouble for you when we land." "I haven't caused any disturbance," Nathan replied, his tone never shifting. "I'm speaking to you quieter than the engines. I'm not blocking the aisle. I'm not threatening anyone. The only thing I've done is ask why the meal I paid for was handed to someone else. If that's a disturbance, then I think we're working from 2 different dictionaries." Chelsea's face went hard. She wasn't used to being answered back so calmly. His composure threw her more than any outburst would have, because a man who yells she could label irate passenger. But this one she had no label for. "Fine," she said low. "You wait right here. You'll see how this ends." "I think so too," Nathan said. "We'll both see how this ends." That was a threat, clear and calculated. But there was one thing Chelsea didn't notice in that entire exchange. The only person who looked rattled was her. Nathan was as calm as a man who'd already seen every step play out. She hit the button to call Diane Kessler. While they waited, Nathan went back to his seat. He leaned down to Sophie, whispered something that made her smile, then took from his backpack an item he had never let anyone see the whole flight. A plastic ID card on a lanyard tucked in a zippered inner pocket. He didn't put it on. Not yet. He just held it in his hand, turning it over like a man about to make a decision. And now might be the time to tell you who Nathan Brooks really is. Nathan wasn't just an ordinary single dad flying to the sea, or at least that wasn't the only reason he was on Flight 216 that morning. Nathan Brooks was a senior field inspector for the National Aviation Standards Board. His job was to fly anonymously on commercial flights unannounced, no one the wiser to evaluate the service and safety of the airlines. His reports determined whether an airline's operating service certification got renewed. And today, he'd simply happened to pick Altair's Flight 216 for a routine evaluation. He'd planned to sit quietly, take notes, and write a standard report. Until Chelsea Vaughn set a tray of leftovers down in front of his daughter. His leather notebook was full now. Every timestamp, every line. Every time a paying passenger was ignored while another was pampered for the word platinum. All of it recorded accurate to the minute. Here's the part that matters. Nathan had never wanted to use that card. In 8 years on the job, he'd flown hundreds of anonymous flights, and almost every time he'd simply watched, then left, leaving behind a report no one knew was his. He believed good service had to be good for everyone, even when no one was keeping score. That was exactly what he came to test, not how an airline behaves when it knows an inspector is aboard, but how it behaves when it thinks no one is watching. And Altair Airways, through Chelsea Vaughn, had just given him the clearest answer he'd ever seen. Now the audience knows who Nathan is. Chelsea doesn't. Gregory doesn't. Diane doesn't. The only question left was, how far would Nathan let this go? He could stand up right now and end it all with a single sentence. Or he could wait. Wait and see how far these people would take it, as long as they believed the man in the old hoodie had no power at all. He decided to wait. Not out of spite, because an honest report needs the whole truth, including the worst of it. The plane was 35 minutes from landing. The seatbelt sign was still off. But the clock was counting down, and the moment the wheels touched the ground, everything Nathan had recorded would become an official report that couldn't be taken back. Diane Kessler arrived at row 34 with the face of someone who'd already decided who was right and who was wrong before she'd heard a thing. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking Nathan up and down without hiding it. Chelsea spoke first. "Ma'am, this passenger has been complaining non-stop about the food and getting confrontational. I tried to explain the flight is full, but he won't listen. I think we should write him up." Diane nodded without once turning to ask Nathan a single question. "Sir," she said to him in the cold voice of authority, "I'm the lead cabin attendant on this flight. On my aircraft, being confrontational with the crew is a serious matter. I'm going to note your name in an incident report. When we land, there may be airport security waiting for you. Do you understand?" The cabin went dead silent. Sophie began to cry. She didn't understand what was happening, only that grown-ups were talking to her dad in angry voices, that someone had said security, that everyone around them was looking at the two of them as if they'd done something wrong. "Daddy, are we getting arrested?" she sobbed. And this was the low point. The kindest man on that flight, the one who'd given his own meal to his child who hadn't raised his voice once, was now being treated like a criminal in front of his daughter on a day that was supposed to hold nothing but love and the memory of a wife who was gone. For 1 second, and only one something crossed Nathan's face. Not fear for himself, he knew exactly how this would end. It was the pain of watching his daughter cry. He'd promised Hannah he'd give the girl a good day, a day to remember her mother. And now, instead of joy, Sophie was learning that the world can be cruel to people who have nothing to prove their worth. That moment, watching a tear roll down his daughter's cheek, was what made Nathan decide. He wouldn't stay silent anymore, not for revenge, but so his little girl would see that kindness in the end is not weakness. Gregory Pierce, back in row 32, turned to watch the scene with a satisfied smile. "There it is," he said to his seatmate. "I told you, these types." He didn't know it was the last thing he'd say, with the confidence of a man who believed he was on the winning side. Nathan leaned down and wiped Sophie's tears. "No, sweetheart. We are not getting arrested. I promise. Close your eyes and rest a minute. Everything's going to be fine." Then he stood up straight, turned to Diane Kessler, and said in that eerily calm voice, "I understand. Go ahead and write it up. But I want you to be sure of one thing before you put my name in it." "And what's that?" Diane asked, her voice full of contempt. Nathan held the plastic card in his hand. He slipped the lanyard over his head and let the card fall against the chest of his hoodie. And the whole galley went still. On the card was Nathan's photo, his full name, and a line in bold that Diane Kessler read instantly: Nathan Brooks, Senior Inspector, National Aviation Standards Board. Below it, a smaller line, but a far more frightening one to anyone who worked in aviation, authorized to conduct unannounced service and safety evaluations. The blood drained from Diane Kessler's face. 28 years in the business, and she knew exactly what that card meant. It meant the man in the old hoodie she'd just threatened to write up, the man her crew had just served a tray of leftovers, was the person with the power to write a report that could cost Altair its service certification. I didn't know," Diane stammered. "That's right," Nathan said. "You didn't know, and that's exactly the problem. You were ready to write up a passenger without asking him a single question. Ms. Vaughn was ready to serve leftovers to a paying passenger without checking the system. Neither of you knew who I was." He paused. "But that isn't the point. The point is, it should never have depended on who I am." Chelsea Vaughn stood frozen. In her head, the last hour rewound like a reel of film, the leftover tray, the line, "Some people just don't know where they belong." The threat to write him up. All of it said and done right in front of the one person who could end her career. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. That talent she was so proud of, sizing up a passenger in 3 seconds, turned out never to have been a skill at all. It was just prejudice, and prejudice had just walked her to the edge of a cliff. But Nathan didn't have to prove anything himself, because the truth had already started to surface. From row 35, the college student Devin Klein stood up, phone in hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little shaky but firm. "I recorded the whole thing. From the moment the attendant put that leftover tray down to when she said some people just don't know where they belong. It's all right here. He held the phone up. At the same moment, Priya Nair stepped out from the galley. In her hand was a sheet of paper, a printout of the flight's meal log. Ms. Kessler, Priya said, her voice steady for the first time. I need to hand this over. The galley log clearly shows 2 chicken meals were pre-ordered for seat 34C. There was no system mix-up. This passenger's meal was given to seat 32A when he asked for a second one, and the tray Mr. Brooks was served was a return tray from the forward cabin. I watched Chelsea take it off the bottom shelf. The evidence was there. The video. The log. The testimony. Nathan didn't have to say another word. The truth had spoken for itself. And then the most telling thing happened. Gregory Pierce, who had just been smiling with satisfaction, suddenly realized the tide had turned. He shot up out of seat 32A. Hold on, he said loudly, throwing up both hands. I've got nothing to do with any of this. I just asked for an extra meal. I didn't tell her to take someone else's. She did that on her own. He pointed at Chelsea. She's the one who offered to bring me a second tray. I'm just a regular customer. Chelsea whipped around to face him, her face going white. You? What are you saying? You demanded 2 meals. You told me to look at who's allowed up in this cabin. I never said any such thing, Gregory shouted back. Don't drag me into this to save your own job. Actually, Devon spoke up from row 35. You did. He tapped the screen and Gregory's own voice played back crisp through the little speaker. You ought to look at who's allowed up in this cabin. He scrolled ahead. Gregory's voice again. This is why I always fly first, so I don't have to sit near these types. The cabin buzzed. A couple of people let out a dry laugh. The elderly woman in 33 shook her head. Gregory Pierce, who a moment ago had been waving his arms and pointing fingers, now stood there with his face flushed, then draining pale mouth open, but nothing coming out. The expensive watch on his wrist, the platinum card in his wallet, none of it could erase a recording of his own voice. And so the two who'd been on the same side a moment before, the entitled man and the enabler, were now tearing into each other in front of the whole cabin, each of them trying to bury the other to save themselves. No one needed Nathan to do anything. Their own arrogance had turned into the weapon that came back around on them. Nathan had seen it many times in his career. The people who stand together when things are easy are always the first to let go of each other when the storm hits. Nathan just stood there quietly, watching, one hand still resting on the shoulder of his sleeping daughter. Diane Kessler, shaking, pressed the button to the flight deck. A few minutes later, Captain Elliot Marsh came out into the cabin himself, something a captain rarely does mid-flight. He'd been briefed over the intercom. He looked at the card on Nathan's chest, gave a formal nod, and turned to the cabin crew. Ms. Vaughn, he said, per company policy, with a serious service violation documented during an evaluation, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. You will not serve for the remainder of this flight. When we land, HR will be waiting for you. Chelsea Vaughn, who for 4 years had been so confident sizing up passengers in 3 seconds, now stood there, hands trembling, tears beginning to spill. She untied her service apron, and under the eyes of 100 passengers walked quietly to the back of the cabin and sat down in an empty crew seat. 21 minutes. That was the span of time from when she set the leftover tray down in front of Nathan to when she took off her apron. As for you, Ms. Kessler, Captain Marsh said to Diane, the fact that you were prepared to write up a passenger without any investigation will be noted in the report. We'll talk after we land. Diane only nodded, unable to speak. And Gregory Pierce. The captain turned to him last. Mr. Pierce, your conduct on this flight has also been captured on a passenger's video. Altair reserves the right to review your membership status. Please return to your seat and remain orderly for the rest of the flight. The platinum card, the 1.2 million miles, none of it meant anything now. Gregory sank into his seat, red-faced, not daring to look at anyone. The last 35 minutes of the flight passed in a strange quiet. Priya Nair took over Chelsea's section. The first thing she did was bring Nathan a hot meal left over from the crew galley, setting it down gently along with an apple juice for Sophie. I'm sorry about all of it, sir, she said softly. Nathan just smiled. You have nothing to apologize for. You were the only person on this flight who did the right thing from the very start. Before he went back to the flight deck, Captain Marsh paused beside Nathan's row and lowered his voice. For what it's worth, he said. "I've flown for this airline 19 years. What happened today shouldn't have happened, and I won't pretend otherwise in my own log." Nathan looked at him. "That's the difference between you and the two people I just watched blame each other," he said. "You didn't wait to find out who I was before you decided to tell the truth." The captain held his gaze a moment, nodded once, and went forward. Nathan opened his notebook a final time, and under the day's entries added one more line. Not about a violation, but about the captain and the young attendant who had done right. A report he'd always believed should be as honest about the good as it is about the bad. Otherwise, it isn't a report, it's a punishment. And Nathan had never been in the business of punishment. Before landing, Diane Kessler came to Nathan one more time. This time, there was no voice of authority left in her. "I was wrong," she said, and her voice caught. 28 years and I still made the exact mistake I always tell new hires to avoid. I listened to one side and I overlooked a human being." Nathan nodded. "Admitting that is the first step. A lot of people never even get there." When the plane touched down and the doors opened, the passengers began to file off. The strange thing was that no one stopped to say goodbye to Gregory Pierce. The man who'd once believed the whole world owed him respect now sat curled by the window, waiting until the cabin was nearly empty before he quietly stepped out alone. The plane landed at Maribel Cove at 11:03 in the morning. As the seatbelt sign switched off and passengers began to rise, something unexpected happened. The elderly woman in row 33 started to clap, then Devin Klein. Then one by one the whole cabin was clapping, not for Nathan and his inspector's card, but for the man who had calmly given his meal to his child, who had refused to sink to the level of the people who humiliated him. Before leaving the plane, Nathan stopped beside Priya Nair. "You did the right thing today," he said. "When nobody knew who I was, you were still kind. That's what counts. Your name will be in my report, but in a very different part of it." By the time Nathan and Sophie reached their hotel that evening, Devin Klein's video had already found its way online. He'd posted it with a plain caption, "No outrage, no editing, just what happened." By morning, it had been viewed 2 million times. By the end of the week, it had aired on 3 news programs. People weren't sharing it because of the inspector's card or the dramatic reveal. They were sharing it because of a quieter thing, a father who gave his meal to his daughter and never once raised his voice. 3 weeks later, Priya Nair was promoted to cabin service supervisor, the youngest in Altair's history. In the memo announcing it, the airline quoted a single line from Nathan's report that she had done the right thing when she believed no one was watching. Chelsea Vaughn was let go after an internal investigation. 2 former colleagues later admitted she'd treated passengers this way for years, and no one had ever said a word. Diane Kessler was pulled from lead duties and required to retake the airline's entire course on passenger conduct, the same course she'd once taught to new hires. And Gregory Pierce received a letter informing him that his platinum membership and every mile attached to it had been revoked indefinitely. He wrote back 3 times to appeal. The airline's answer each time was the same recording of his own voice. Altair Airways itself did not lose its certification. Because of a second line in Nathan's report, the one about a captain who told the truth, and a young attendant who did right, the board concluded the failure was individual, not institutional, and gave the airline 90 days to retrain its crews. In the end, the leftover tray that was meant to humiliate one man became the reason 100 other passengers on flights Nathan would never take were treated a little better. But that wasn't the part Nathan remembered most about that day. That afternoon, he walked Sophie hand in hand along the beach at Maribel Cove to the foot of the white lighthouse where 10 years earlier he had proposed to Hannah. He took out the locket, opened it, and let Sophie look at the photo of her mother. "Can Mommy see us, Daddy?" Sophie asked. "She can, sweetheart. She always sees us." Nathan knelt down to his daughter's level. "Sophie, on the plane today, you saw some people treat me unkindly. Do you remember what I did? You didn't yell at them. You stayed nice." "That's right, because your mommy taught me something. She said if you want to know who a person really is, don't look at how they treat someone who can help them. Look at how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. That's who they really are." Sophie nodded. She didn't understand all of it yet, but she would remember. One day she'd understand. The sea wind came in off the water, carrying the sound of the waves. Father and daughter stood there at the foot of the lighthouse, keeping a promise in full. And maybe that was the real justice. Not the card, not the report, not the wrongdoers getting what they deserved. It was a kind man who, in the middle of a storm of contempt, never lost himself. Because the way we treat the people we've decided don't matter, that is the answer to the question of who we really are.